The history of consumerism is actually quite interesting. If you take a deeper look into it, it all started in Europe when essentially for ages people were living, under extreme poverty, right? And you know, over over the course of time in Northwest Europe, primarily in England, a new form of production started to take place. And that was, capitalism's first baby steps. And essentially, what happened is people started to realize that by taking debt and betting into the future, and with society speeding up the cycle of consumption, society itself was able to generate more wealth, right? And so what this enabled is people, regular people, to be able to make a living wage and be able to go spend money on things that before they couldn't. Up until that point, they were primarily concerned with putting food on the table and keeping a roof over their heads and essentially having clothes, right? Not a wardrobe full of it, just clothes to wear, right? And essentially, what capitalism enabled these people at the time was to go and, hey, I get to kind of pick what I eat now, or I get to buy thicker boots for the winter, or a bigger coat, and so forth. And so you can see kind of how this started to, roll into where we are today, where in capitalist societies, which is, well, most of the world, people essentially spend majority of their time spending, right? Consumption is what keeps the world turning, right? That's how countries grow, economies grow. That's how the standard of living improves. If you're able to have a system that enables people to make money so they can spend more, right? So that they need to make more money to spend more, and companies pay these people better and better wages so that they can then spend more money. That was the whole idea of the Ford factory, right? Henry Ford, he said, look, I want to be able to pay my people a wage that allows them to buy my cars. Well, it wasn't exactly the intent, of course, we all know that. It was, essentially a way to keep people and working for him. But at the time, if you started working in a Ford factory, you knew exactly what your career would look like. Nowadays, though, if you are working at a Microsoft of the world, you have no idea where your career is going to end up, right? It's a far more dynamic environment than it ever was back in the day. But coming back to, the history of consumerism, and the reason why I start here is because consumerism has had a tremendous impact in our physical spaces. And by that I mean our cities, right? And so it doesn't take much for you to see the contrast between a consumer-centric city versus a, I guess, interaction-centered city. And I'll explain the two concepts. So when you think about a city, there are two main forms of spaces that I think that will really help make sense of what it is, how a city operates. So you have what Zygmunt Bauman has described as your non-places. So think of these non-places as airports, train stations, places of transience, right? Where people are able to enter, but they are encouraged to leave. They're there, but they don't bring their personality with them. They're just going through it, right? So zero interaction, right? Well, the other type of place is what Zygmunt Bauman has also described as a place of consumption. So what do I mean by that, place of consumption? So of course you can probably infer shopping malls, right? Cafeterias, cafes, things like that, where these spaces are designed for action. What do I mean by that? Action in the sense of consumption, spending, not interaction. Interaction in these consumer-centric cities gets in the way of action, gets in the way of spending. That's why you can enter a mall in New York City, in Toronto, Minnesota, Minneapolis, and you're going to be surrounded by thousands of strangers and not interact with a single one of them for the whole 2 hours you're there, because it's the space designed for spending. And so when you look at cities, a lot of their designs, particularly North America, so these are very, that really abide by the capitalist doctrine. They're built far later than cities in Europe or even in the Middle East. These North American cities were designed to encourage spending and consumption. Now you go across the North Atlantic, go to Europe, particularly continental Europe, and you take a stroll down Rome, you're not going to see a single billboard. You're not going to see this overwhelming pressure to spend and act. As a matter of fact, you're going to run into a bunch of piazzas, so places that encourage interaction. You actually see people sitting alongside other people talking, sparking, conversation right in front of a water fountain, while there's some guy, playing tricks or doing some sort of magic on the park, right? There's of course pickpockets as well as part of it, but it is a place that encourages interaction. So that is a very different environment than walking down Broadway, New York City, right? We're being bombarded by advertising. And so when people are in this consumption environments in North America, there is this element of civility that is imperative for the proper functioning of a capitalist society. So by civility, I mean people are encouraged to wear a mask, metaphorical mask. So they don't bring their dreams and personal problems into those spaces. And that actually functions not as a form of withdrawal, but actually of participation. Because if everybody was maskless, all hell would break loose. So in a context of a society, a civil society, it is important that human beings are able to separate private life from public life. Now, what we see today in the 21st century, postmodern world, is this, companies encouraging consumers to share their deepest secrets. And this isn't a new thing. It actually in the 20th century started with talk shows, but with social media, you went to a whole new level, right? Everybody has a camera, right in their pocket, and they're able to share with the world the deepest insecurities and secrets and aspirations. And that is all incredibly valuable raw material for the consumption economy, if you think about it. Because if you're a brand and you're able to create quote unquote communities around groups of people that think alike, that dream alike, that have the same sorts of insecurities or fears or aspirations, you're able to market your product based on a value, based on an intangible asset, you could call it, that would far outlast any physical invention or functionality that your product or service could ever come up with. And so this creates a bit of a dichotomy, right? Is that in this great cities designed for consumption, which don't encourage community, encourage action, are actually giving birth to quote unquote digital communities where people share private lives, so that they can be sold to. So you can see how there is, a bit of a contradiction in this capitalist cities, right? Cities that are designed to be for consumption, right? So for the cities, as opposed for you to having the architecture and spaces of interaction taking center stage, you actually have spaces where you get to spend as taking the center stage. The more places to spend, the more the city grows, the better the quality of life people will eventually get with wealth creation. But there's also the underpinning, you know, elephant in the room is that this excessive consumption doesn't really fulfill us. So by quality of life, if you mean standard of living, yes, that improves. But our well-being per se doesn't come close to a city that is designed for interaction because we are social beings. So there is a very important distinction there between action and interaction that is important to understand when you think about cities and when you think about spaces and how the real world interacts with the consumption economy, right? And so while there is a gigantic chasm between the lifestyles of European cities as opposed to North American cities, the 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 premise is that one is better than the other, and that is not the case, right? As with everything, there is two sides of a coin. There's a lot of nuance to this conversation. All it takes for you to realize that is the droves of American teens, recent graduates that travel to Europe, right? Because of how amazing Europe is to go spend money and hang out and meet people, right? A lot of youth goes to Europe to meet people, and they quickly realize what they've been missing out this entire time. Whereas if you are in a big urban center in North America, these sorts of spontaneous interactions are a lot more difficult to organically happen, right? And so we try to create environments where that can happen, but it's very difficult to design this sorts of artificial spaces, right, to encourage interaction. Interaction happens in the wild, and I think cities are the quote unquote jungle where if they are designed properly, with architecture interaction sitting at the center stage, those sorts of organic interactions happen organically. But the other side of the coin here is that, well, we all know of the economic stagnation woes that Europe has faced for decades, right? And that the speed at which capitalism turns in Europe is not as fast as the speed at which capitalism turns in America. And so what you have is, an environment where the quality of life in the sense of well-being is much better, but what you're seeing is extremely high unemployment rates among the youth, and mass migration towards countries that push the limit a little bit more towards the consumption environment. Think of London. Think of Berlin, right? Even Berlin is a little so-so, right? It's more London that I'm talking about. Or they fly across the Atlantic and go work in North America. And so there's a saying that goes that, hey, America is the best place to make money, but Europe is the best place to spend money. And there is a lot of truth to that, right? Unfortunately, you can't have both. It is a very difficult place. It's an elusive place in our minds. But nonetheless, I think this is an important distinction for us to make and see how our physical spaces interact with how our consumption economy operates, and how brands, they have free reign in consumption societies to live freely, whereas humans actually don't, right? If companies actually feel restrained in America, the government is quick to implement legislation to enable the free flow of capital and innovation and consumption to continue. Whereas if you go to a beach in the United States, you will notice that it's illegal to drink alcohol on the beach, right? That actually it is a stark contradiction, right? You know, being able to share a drink with friends encourages interaction, and supposedly encourages consumption as well. I mean, if you go to Las Vegas, people drink and they spend more, but there are still some pockets, right, in this consumption society where the desire and the need to keep the mask on people's faces is more important than letting them live, more freely. Yet, brands have free reign in such society. So, anyways, just some thoughts. Let me know what you think, and don't forget to check out my Marketing Chronicles newsletter, where I talk about topics such as this one.